So dear beloved community, it's such a joy to be together with everybody again this evening. It's the 5th of July. We made it. We made it this far. So this is something truly to celebrate. Thank you so much for putting aside some time to develop your heart and to focus in on the practices of mindfulness. I'm really excited to be continuing on with this next series of talks. In the Compassionate Ocean Sangha, we put out a survey and I asked people to share what they would like to hear teachings on. And people requested teachings on the Four Nutriments and then the Noble Eightfold Path and the Four Noble Truths. So for the next period of time, we'll be looking deeply into aspects of the Noble Eightfold Path and the Four Noble Truths as shared by the Buddha, our teacher. This is truly a happy moment to have the opportunity to spend time together with each of you. And whether or not it's a happy moment, each moment of our life depends on the quality of our attention and what we're open to in each moment. Yesterday, I had the opportunity to be down at the Bilpin Community Hall, which is not far from the monastery that I'm currently staying in, Mountain Spring. And on every Saturday, there's a village market. So a lot of the villagers come together and exchange their goods and chat about what's happening in the village. And it's such a lovely experience for everybody to be there. The village suggested to us that Mountain Spring should have a stall. And I said, well, we don't really have anything to sell. They said, you don't need to sell anything. Just come there and be yourselves. So we decided that we would have a stall that would have calligraphies of "You have enough," and that we would just be there and share together with everybody. So we did. We had a beautiful day, and we offered some Vietnamese egg rolls, some Vietnamese spring rolls for the friends that were there, and people were asking about the meditation class that we offer in the village for locals and things. It was beautiful. And at one point, a young girl who's the child of the baker. We're lucky to have a baker in the village who's a meditator as well. He grinds his own flour and he makes bread with a lot of love. And during the lockdown period, of course, I was unable to meet him, but I felt that I met him through his bread. And so when we were able to go outside of the property and to meet him in person, it was like meeting an old friend. So he and his family are all living very simply and baking bread and sharing, and they have the most wonderful children. And the youngest child is about 4 years old. So their stall was opposite our stall yesterday at the markets, and she saw us and she picked up something from the stall and she walked over towards me and handed it to me. And it was a piece of wood with 2 rose quartz tied onto each end of the piece of wood. And I said, what is it, Neela? And she said, this is a fairy wand, and you need it. So I said, do you want me to put it on the stall? And she said, no, it's for you, it's for you. And so I came home from the market with a fairy wand with some rose quartz to open the heart chakra. But and this was a very beautiful moment to have a young child, just so innocent and so open, come over and to share a little gift that she'd made herself, believe it or not, with us. So each moment can be a gift if we're open to it. There's a beautiful story that Tay tells in Old Path, White Clouds. It's based on a sutra. One afternoon, Sariputra and Moggallana, the 2 senior disciples of the Buddha, they brought a friend who was the ascetic Dighanakha to meet the Buddha. Dighanakha was also Sariputra's uncle. And when Dighanakha heard that Sariputra was the disciple of the Buddha, he was quite curious about the Buddha's teaching, as anybody would be. He wanted to come and to see who Sariputra had taken refuge in. So Sariputra brought him along to meet the Buddha, and Dighanakha took the opportunity to ask the Buddha a few questions. He asked the Buddha, so what's your teaching? What are your doctrines? For me, myself, I dislike all doctrines and theories. I don't like them at all. In fact, I don't subscribe to any doctrines or theories. And the Buddha smiled and asked, so you say you don't subscribe to any doctrines or theories. Do you subscribe to your doctrine of not subscribing to any doctrines or theories? Do you have faith in your doctrine of not believing? And as we can imagine, Diganaka was pretty taken aback. And he said, well, whether I believe in my own doctrine or don't believe in my doctrine, it's not important. And the Buddha spoke quite gently and said, once we're caught in a belief in a doctrine, we lose all of our freedom. When we become dogmatic, then we believe that our doctrine, our views are the only truth, and all disputes and conflicts arise from narrow views like this. An attachment to views is the greatest impediment to the spiritual path. If we get caught up in narrow views or in incomplete views, we become so entangled, so caught up, that it's no longer possible to let the door of truth open. And then he goes on to tell Diganaka a story about a widower who lived with their young child. He loved his young child more than his own life. And one day his job took him away for the day. And while he was away, a band of thieves came in and they ransacked the whole village, and then they burned down the village. And once they burned down the village, they kidnapped this young child. When the man returned home, he saw that the whole village had been burned down. It was abandoned. And he came to the ruins of his house and saw that his house had been burned to ashes. And right in front of the house was the burned body of a young child. He believed that that was the body of his young child. And of course, he was absolutely devastated, and he cremated the remains of the child. And because he loved his child so dearly, he put the ashes of his child in a little pouch that he carried with him everywhere he went. And several months later, his child managed to escape from the kidnappers and made their way home. Arriving in the middle of the night, the child knocked at the door. But at that moment, the father was wailing and crying and hugging the bag of ashes, wailing that the child had been taken from him. So the child was banging at the door and calling out the father's name. And the father heard that, but then opened the window and said, just called out the window, "Who are you to make fun of me? My child is dead. My child is dead. You go away." And no matter how hard the child would call out and say, "I'm your child, I'm your child," the father kept saying that, "My child is dead. My child is dead. Stop making fun of me. You have to leave." So finally, the child had no choice but to wander off and leave their father alone. And then the Buddha goes on to share with Diganaka that if we're attached to some belief and we hold it to be absolute truth, then we may one day find ourselves in a similar situation to this young widower. In fact, I think if we're really honest, many times in our lives, we find ourselves in similar situations to this young widower, thinking that we already understand everything, that what we think we know is the absolute truth. Whatever view we have, it's absolute truth. Then it's so hard to open our minds to receive any new information or any different perspectives, even if truth or a different perspective comes knocking on our door, calling out our name. And then the story continues on. Diganaka then asks the Buddha, well, what of your own teaching? If someone follows your teaching, will they get caught in narrow views that you've given them? Maybe you're giving them a whole new set of views. And then the Buddha says, well, my teaching is not a doctrine or a philosophy. Mental conjecture, just thinking about this, that, and the other, and discursive thought about truth are like ants crawling around the rim of a bowl. They never get anywhere. My teaching is not a philosophy. It's the result of direct experience. The things I say come from my own experience, and you need to confirm them all from your own experience. I teach that everything's impermanent and without a separate self. This I've learned from my own direct experience, and you need to do that too. I teach that all things depend on other things to arise, develop, and pass away, and that nothing is created from a single original source. I've directly experienced this truth, and this is my invitation for you also. My goal is not to explain the whole universe, but to help to guide others have a direct experience of reality for themselves. Words cannot describe absolute reality. Only direct experience enables us to see the true face of reality. And Diganaka then says, well, that's wonderful, Gautama, but what would happen if somebody, just maybe somebody, one or two people, accepted your teaching as a doctrine rather than a practice? Of course, there's nobody like that these days. Everybody puts everything into practice, right? The Buddha was quiet for a moment and then nodded his head and said, Diganaka, that's a very good question. My teaching is not a dogma or a doctrine, but for sure, some people will take it as such. My teaching is a method to experience reality, and not reality. My teaching is not reality itself. It's like a finger pointing at the moon, but that finger is not the moon itself. A person who looks only at the finger and mistakes it for the moon will never see the real moon. My teaching is a means of practice, like a raft used to cross the river. Only a fool would carry the raft around after they'd already reached the other shore, the shore of liberation. A while back, a few weeks ago, I was sharing about the overlooked fact that one of the greatest teachings of the Plum Village practice is in the sutra opening verse, to see the Dharma. We make the aspiration when we begin our chanting to see the Dharma, to see the teaching in each and every moment, to hear the Dharma. We're pretty good at that already, to hear Dharma in Dharma talks. To study the Dharma, we're also pretty good at that. We can read so many books on Dharma and listen to so many Dharma talks and think about the Dharma, but the one we have challenges with is actually putting the Dharma, any Dharma really, anything at all, into sustained practice. And so I often invite my friends to just choose one thing and to apply it wholeheartedly, because that one thing, as simple as it might be, as seemingly everyday, such as the practice of stopping, can be enough to transform our life. And when we think about the spiritual path, a lot of us have a lot of different ideas of what that might be, how the spiritual path manifests. Some of us think it's the same for every single person. Some of us think it's quite unique. So what did the Buddha say about what the spiritual path actually is? Glad you asked. In the Samyutta Nikaya, number 45, the Buddha meets a mendicant, meets a wanderer. And the story goes that a wanderer went up to the Buddha and asked the Buddha, "Sir, everybody everywhere is talking about this thing called the spiritual path. What is the spiritual path? And what's the fruit of the spiritual path?" I think this wanderer asked a very good question and asked that question for all of us. So what did the Buddha say? The Buddha said, "Friend, the spiritual path is simply the practice of the Noble Eightfold Path. That is right view, right intention and thought, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, and right immersion or right concentration. The transformation of greed, hatred or aversion, and delusion. This is the culmination of the spiritual path." When we think about the Buddha's teachings, the first flowering of the Buddha's teaching, the real core of Buddhism, the real essence of Buddhism is the insight of the Four Noble Truths. Everything springs from that realization, and every explanation, every extension of the Buddha's teachings, from the most simple to the most profound, stem from this hub, stem from this very core. And they're a response to the issue of the Four Noble Truths, these insights into the nature of reality. The fourth of the Four Noble Truths is itself the Noble Eightfold Path. In a sense, it's fair to say that the Four Noble Truths would be the doctrinal underpinning of the Buddha's teachings, the kind of this is why underpinning of the Buddha's teachings. And then the Noble Eightfold Path is that this is what you need to do. This is what to the why, the what to the why. The Noble Eightfold Path being the practical manifestation and application of how to transform our situation and generate that insight, the insight of the Four Noble Truths right in the heart of our daily lives, in the heart of your own life. The Noble Eightfold Path and the Four Noble Truths interpenetrate and include each other. The formula of the Four Noble Truths, as I shared just a moment ago, contains the Noble Eightfold Path. And the Noble Eightfold Path contains the Four Noble Truths. They're like the two wings of a bird. Why don't we enjoy a sound of the bell? Buddhism at its core is incredibly practical. Any real insight has to be concrete and practically applied to be of any use. Some of us might be thinking, I know some of us probably are, which one is more important, the Four Noble Truths or the Noble Eightfold Path? And this is a very good question. And I do hope some of us are reflecting on this question and asking, which is more important, the Four Noble Truths or the Noble Eightfold Path? If we are asking that question, the answer would have to be the path, because it helps us to apply the teaching, apply this insight in our daily lives, and helps us to generate this insight, the insight of the Four Noble Truths for ourselves, right here and right now. That we're not, the Noble Eightfold Path transforms the Four Noble Truths from just a theory into a fruit of the practice that we can realize for ourselves right here and right now. So therefore, Noble Eightfold Path would have to be the answer. Tay himself was once asked, if you had to choose, would you choose to preserve Buddhism or would you choose world peace? And Tay immediately replied, I would choose world peace. And this is exactly the insight of Buddhism. Rather than getting stuck in doctrine for the sake of doctrine, we will always focus on, or hopefully, always focus on the practical manifestations and experience of insight. The Noble Eightfold Path, when we apply it in our daily life, transforms the Dharma from a collection of abstract ideas, abstract lists that we have to memorize and recite. Suffering, impermanence, non-self, suffering, impermanence, non-self, and so on, into a continually unfolding experience of insight, making the Buddha's goal and Buddhism's goal liberation from suffering, and understanding and transforming our suffering at its very root, accessible to us right here and right now. Not only for those of us who were practicing 2,600 years ago, but right here and right now. In fact, we're always reminded by Tay of the fact that the Dharma is described as being immediately useful and effective. If you don't immediately feel a relief when practicing meditation, walking meditation, sitting meditation, eating meditation, if you don't immediately feel better, feel more at ease, then Tate tells us your practice is incorrect. And the Buddha himself, in the recollections of the Dharma, shared that the Dharma is immediately useful and effective, bears immediate fruit. So it's not a hard labor for 10, 20, 30 years, and finally we attain something, but something that needs to be useful and applicable in every moment, right here and right now, bearing fruit right here and right now. Let's be honest with each other for a minute. Some of us love ideas just a little bit too much more than actually putting something into practice. So many Buddhist practitioners, as I shared a moment ago, memorize a whole lot of lists, read a whole lot of books, which is not bad in itself. It's wonderful. Memorizing all of these profound teachings, but never take the next step to be able to penetrate to some level these teachings, going from the level of doctrine into insights, and to discover how these teachings manifest right in the heart of their lives. And that's a pity. There was a funny cartoon that a young person sent me a couple of months back. It seems like young people have got a lot of time for these things, and it's wonderful. We need it. So in this cartoon, it had the image of the Buddha with a bemused expression on his face, kind of a strange expression. And the caption read, that moment when you realized you shared the way for people to transform their suffering 2,600 years ago, but they still don't get it. Let's have a sound of the bell. So even though the Four Noble Truths are usually taught first, the Noble Eightfold Path is usually taught against the foundation of the Four Noble Truths as an extension of the Four Noble Truths. Due to the fact that many of us, myself included, like ideas a little too much, I've decided to begin with each of the steps of the Noble Eightfold Path. With an analysis of the Noble Eightfold Path in terms of the threefold training, and then move towards the very central insight of Buddhism, the Four Noble Truths, in order to complete this series. I really want to begin with practical steps. So to transform our ignorance, to transform our delusion, our unclarity, our confusion, it's quite easy to understand that we need to cultivate some wisdom, some insight. But how do we do that? As much as we would wish it to be different. Wisdom can't be gained by mere learning, by gathering and accumulating a whole heap of facts and information, but by sending a taproot down into the heart of your own life, wherever you are. That's where insight arises from. By looking deeply and clearly at what is happening in your life right here and right now, what's happening in your mind, what's happening in your consciousness right here and right now. Looking deeply and clearly at what is, and also how it came to be. How did it arise? So there's two aspects of noticing what's there and then considering how and why did it arise. You know, there's that old saying, that old joke, that knowledge is knowing that a tomato is a fruit. Wisdom is not putting it in the fruit salad. Wisdom arises from embodied experience and cultivating the capacity to be able to see the operation and development of each of these path factors, the Noble Eightfold Path factors in our daily life. The Buddha himself called the Noble Eightfold Path the middle way. In Pali, that's Majjhima Patipada. It's called the middle way because it steers clear of two extremes, two misguided attempts to try to avoid or to run away from pain or discomfort, which is our usual tendency. I really want to reiterate a point that I've made a few times over the course of the talks that I've given since arriving in Australia. Because if nothing else at all from tonight's talk, remember this, and please remember it well. There is nothing inherently wrong with suffering. There's nothing inherently bad with suffering or discomfort. It's part of the way things are in this human realm. It would be a shame to treat our pain with aversion, with hatred. Because in a strange way, by running away from suffering, this tendency to want to avoid suffering, we only run into its arms. It seems to me that it's by having courage to turn towards your suffering, to look into it and to understand how it came to be. And from understanding how it came to be in you, recognizing how it can be transformed, it's then that you touch for yourself insight, and you touch for yourself liberation. You don't need at that moment anybody else to tell you anything. You've discovered it for yourself. One extreme that the middle path, that the Noble Eightfold Path avoids, is the extreme of drowning in sense pleasures, which is one attempt to extinguish this constant dissatisfaction we feel in this human realm, this tendency to always think we need one more thing, by attempting to extinguish it by feeding desire, just thinking we need one more thing all the time. I call it getting comfortable, the tendency to run after small comforts. This approach for sure will give pleasure for a while, but sooner or later, maybe today, maybe 10 years down the track, we discover that any relief is only momentary. And it doesn't really carry a lasting or deep sense of contentment. That relief might last for a little while, that contentment will be there, but very soon we're back where we started again, and we're in that cycle over and over again. The Buddha realized and taught that this kind of pleasure is far inferior to the happiness that arises from letting go. And this is radical and completely counterintuitive to our usual desperation. And it really is a kind of desperation to hold on to things, to hold on to people, or to hold on to behaviors or ideas that we think will give us the security that we crave, or any relief, literally any relief from this sense of dissatisfaction. The other extreme is the practice of self-mortification, the attempt to liberate ourselves from this dissatisfaction we feel by denying ourselves things or punishing our body or mind, or it's kind of a deep sense of aversion to everything, a closing down. And this is the other extreme. One extreme is running right into the arms of sense pleasures, and the other extreme is closing yourself off and punishing yourself. This approach may stem from a genuine wish to transform our suffering, and often it does. But it's based on a wrong assumption, a wrong perception that makes this approach pretty useless. The assumption is that we're somehow bad, that suffering is somehow bad, and that everything, including ourselves, is a problem and a struggle to fix. This is a deep root that many of us in modern society have, this sense that we are a problem and we need to fix ourselves. And that's one extreme. Right in the middle of these two extreme approaches is the Noble Eightfold Path, again called the middle way. Not in the sense that it's a compromise between the two extremes, but in the sense that it transcends them both by avoiding the errors that each one of those two extremes involves. The middle way, the Noble Eightfold Path, is set in the texts for those of us who are sutra geeks. It's said in the text to give rise to vision, to give rise to knowledge, and lead to peace, to direct knowledge for yourself, to awakening and to liberation. So why don't we enjoy a sound of the bell? So hearing this, the question naturally arises, where do we begin? In a funny way, like many things on the spiritual path, we begin at the very end. We begin with the very goal and the fruit of the path. We begin with what's necessary to begin the path, which is the cultivation of right view. And it's also, funnily enough, the very culmination and the end of the path of having developed right view. So we begin at the end and we end at the beginning. It's very beautiful. It is this continually unfolding aspect of the path. The path is not a direct line, it's a spiral journey. You know, it's a Plum Village tradition to name the hamlets of a monastery after a natural feature or a quality. So friends who are here today were asking about this. When we moved in here to Mountain Spring Monastery, for the first few months, we had no hamlet name. Myself and Brother Tenzin were just practicing here, just walking the earth, just breathing, just sitting. And we began looking at some of the natural features and considering our own practice and considering what people were drawn to when they were here in terms of the natural features, and also considering what we felt would be a good focus for the collective practice of those who came to this hamlet. So we began to notice on an outward level, our own personal attention was drawn by the view of the Blue Mountains. We have a very beautiful view over the Blue Mountains National Park to some of the peaks of the Blue Mountains. And on an inner level, we know that the practice of meditation is a practice of cultivating clear view, of the capacity to see things as they really are, and that everything arises from there. So we've named this hamlet the Hamlet of Cultivating Clear View. The Buddha, which is in fact another way of translating the very first step and the culmination of the Noble Eightfold Path, the cultivation of clear view, of seeing what's happening inside and seeing what's happening outside clearly. The Buddha himself, when asked to define what right view is, said the following. He said, "And what is right view? Knowledge with regard to suffering. Knowledge with regard to the origin of suffering. Knowledge with regard to the ending of suffering. And knowledge with regard to the way of practice that leads to the transformation, the ending of suffering. This is called right view." If you have been listening carefully, you'll understand that the Buddha in that little excerpt from the sutra is saying that right view is seeing for yourself the reality right in the heart of your daily life of the Four Noble Truths, seeing their manifestation right in the heart of your own life. So right view, or in Pali, samaditi, is the very first of the 8 path factors in the Noble Eightfold Path. And it belongs to the wisdom or prajna division of the path. Now remember, this is really important. Remember that this is right view and not just views. We're all experts in holding views. In fact, many of us have quite a number of doctorates in being able to hold views. But our views, and even though we might be quite accomplished in them, are not clear and not complete. In this path factor, in this first step and culminating step of the Noble Eightfold Path, we're cultivating right view. So we usually translate samma from the Pali as right, but it can also mean complete, a complete view, seeing something from all aspects, including from within. The 8 factors of the Noble Eightfold Path are not steps to be followed in a sequential order like a project or a to-do list. We're also pretty good, in addition to having doctorates in holding views, we're also quite expert in to-do lists. Our spiritual practice is not a project or a checklist. And the Noble Eightfold Path is not that either. In fact, the Noble Eightfold Path, when you look at its steps, each of the steps are different facets of the same thing, similar in a way to the many strands that are wound together to make a rope. All of those strands strengthen that rope. And in the same way, each of the factors of the Noble Eightfold Path support and strengthen each other. They give rise to each other and they strengthen each other. In earlier talks, and especially in the sutra class on Tuesday evenings, we've been exploring the 2 levels of the threefold training, the way in which many of the sutras, the teachings of the Buddha, are framed. The introductory level of generosity, of ethical behavior, and of mental development or meditation, or the higher level of training of ethical development, our way of relating to ourselves and the world around, of samadhi, of concentration or immersion, and of insight, of generating insight. So the 8 path factors, the factors of the Noble Eightfold Path, divide into 3 groups. First, there's the sila, or ethical behavior group. It's called the Sila Kanda. The group of the ways of relating to the world within and around. And that group is made up of right speech, right action, and right livelihood. The second group is the samadhi, or the concentration group, or immersion group. As I've shared earlier, I like immersion as a translation for samadhi. Samadhi Kanda. And it's made up of right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. And then the third of the 3 groups is the prajna, or wisdom group, which in Pali is Panya Kanda, or Prajna Skanda in Sanskrit, made up of right view and right intention, which for the next couple of weeks we'll be looking into these 2 path factors, right view or complete view, which we're looking into today, and right intention. So these 2 factors constitute the insight, or prajna, grouping of the Noble Eightfold Path. So these 3 groups that we just mentioned represent 3 stages of the higher training. The training in the higher ethics, or ethical behavior, the way that we behave towards ourselves and others, the training in higher consciousness, and the training in the higher wisdom. So the order of the 3 trainings, Sila, Samadhi, Prajna, or Dana, Sila, Bhavana, is determined by the overall direction and the aim of the spiritual path as seen by Buddhism. And in Buddhism, we see the aim of the spiritual path or spiritual practice as generating the insight that liberates. Nothing else. That's it. Even from its very name, this spiritual path is called Buddhism. Buddhism means the way of waking up. In other words, generating the insight that liberates. It might be helpful to remember this each and every moment. Why am I practicing? I am practicing such and such, eating meditation, walking meditation, sitting meditation, whatever it might be, total relaxation, driving the car meditation, in order to generate the insight that liberates. But then don't just stop there. That liberates me from what kind of suffering? Otherwise, suffering is just a concept. What's your suffering? What's the thing that you're practicing to liberate yourself from? So in this way, it gives some kind of focus and intentionality to our practice. I am practicing such and such meditation to generate the insight that liberates me from this situation. Don't get caught up in the concept of suffering, but look at your own discomfort and pain and find a way out. That way out can sometimes be quite surprising. Insight manifests from a mind that's concentrated, and we can only have a concentrated mind if we behave ethically. So you might be feeling a bit confused, and it's okay if we are. We might be feeling a bit confused in considering this natural unfolding of the threefold training of ethics, concentration, and wisdom. This sense that insight manifests if our mind is concentrated, and concentration can only occur if we're behaving ethically, because we won't be worried about getting caught or the effects of our behavior on others and so on. You might be confused as to if the path or the training unfolds in that way. Why don't the associated factors of the Noble Eightfold Path follow that order? For example, why don't the ethical ones come first? Why do the prajna, why do the insight ones come first? Wisdom or insight, which includes right view and right intention, is the very last stage of the threefold training. Yet the two factors are right at the beginning of the path, rather than at the end, as it might seem to make more sense. Believe it or not, this is not a mistake. This is not a mistake that just slipped in somehow. We don't need to revise the order of the Noble Eightfold Path. But it is listed in that way because it comes from the understanding, from the insight that there are many levels of understanding of the spiritual journey and the path. And rather than being a straight line from point A to point B, the path is a spiral path, bringing us back to the same point over and over again. But we experience it in a new way each time. One year, I was asked to lead a retreat. It was actually one of the first retreats we had in the US, specifically for young people. It was many years ago now, before we had Wake Up. And it was at the Mariposa Institute, which now there's a beautiful Sangha there called the Sugar Plum Sangha. It's lovely to see so many people coming there and practicing on that land. But anyway, years ago, we had a retreat there, and Mariposa Institute, as it's called, it has a Spanish name, and Mariposa means butterfly. And it's named like that, we were told, because the land is like the two wings of a butterfly. It's situated on two sides of a canyon. The meditation hall, which is a round wooden structure, was on one side, one wing of the butterfly. And the hut I was staying in was on the very far tip of the other wing of the butterfly. As the crow flies, it was not that great a distance from one side of the canyon to the other. You could almost throw a stick and hit the meditation hut. But the pathway was quite winding. And I remember walking that path many times during the course of the retreat, down to the meditation hut, and then back to the hut where I was staying, down and back, No, at some point, I felt like, gee, I'd like to find a shortcut. I was trying to find a way to walk directly. But then I thought, there's no shortcut. I'll just walk this path as it is. So I enjoyed it as a practice of walking meditation. And I noticed something interesting, that as I would walk, I would stop and enjoy the view each time I came to the corresponding point on each of the paths on the way down and on the way up. And each time I came to that corresponding point and I looked back at the meditation hut, I noticed something different. My perspective was completely different. In the same way, this is what happens in our spiritual path, that our spiritual practice will bring us back over and over and over again to the same point. But hopefully there'll be a deepening and a widening of perspective and understanding each and every time. So in Buddhism, the Buddha's insight is that a basic introductory taste of right view and right intention are the necessary factors to spur us to actually embark on the spiritual journey, even if at the beginning they might be incomplete. They set us on the path. We have this moment where we're like, oh, that makes sense. Oh yeah, we hear a teaching, a Buddhist teaching or something, at some level, something resonates. That's an introductory taste of right view. And it sets us on the path. And then later, as we develop other path factors, right view and right intention continue to ripen. So do the other path factors. So right view is the starting point and the foundation of the entire path, and a guide for all the other path factors. And all the other path factors will lead you back to right view. It's just like we keep saying that we hope all roads eventually lead to Mountain Spring. They seem to. We've always found our way back. It's also the very culmination. It enables us to understand where we are and why we're practicing, as well as the successive landmarks as our practice develops and advances. Occasionally in life, we might experience a serendipity, but usually to arrive at our destination, we have to have some idea of our general direction and the roads leading to that destination. So all of this happens in a framework which is established by right view. Even if that initial taste is really incomplete, it sets us in a certain direction. Just like if we've never been to Paris, we have an idea about Paris. We've read about Paris. Maybe we've seen a movie that featured Paris, or we've heard somebody tell us about it, and we have the inspiration. We develop the intention to go to Paris. So we put forth every effort to go to Paris. We get on the right kind of plane. We don't fly to Sydney if we want to go to Paris, unless you're buying a really cheap ticket, which can sometimes happen. But in general, you're heading in the direction of Paris. And then you will arrive in Paris. And then you will have a taste of Paris for yourself. You will have the experience of Paris, which in some way will be a universal experience of Paris. It'll be in some way shared by other people. Hopefully there'll be some kind of shared understanding, but it'll also be quite a unique experience just for you yourself in some way. And also your view, even your experience of Paris will be incomplete. It won't encapsulate all the different aspects of Paris. Even our view of who we are is the only person who has that view is ourselves, right here and right now. There's no other person in this world, even if they interacted with us, who has the same view of us as we do. There are thousands of you existing right now, or maybe millions if you've met a lot of people, of you existing in so many different people's consciousnesses right now. If you asked all of these people to write down who you are to them, you would have thousands or millions of different views that come. Each of those views is somewhat correct. It's a right view. Each of those views is also quite incomplete, including our own view. So right view is the starting point and foundation of the entire path, setting us in the direction. And it's a continual unfolding as well. It's a continual discovery. There's always something more to learn. And the process of cultivating right view is often quite a humbling one. Let's have a sound of the bell. So I shared earlier that right view gives rise to and strengthens all the other path factors, all the other factors of the Noble Eightfold Path, and all the other factors also strengthen right view. So in the Majjhima Nikaya, the middle length discourses, Sutra number 117, for those of you who would like to look it up, the Buddha says, we practice to abandon wrong view and enter into right view, to cultivate right view. This is right effort. This is the manifestation of right effort. One is mindful to abandon wrong view and to enter and remain in right view. This is your right mindfulness. And then these three qualities, right view, right effort, and right mindfulness, circle around and emerge from and contribute to right view. So before we continue, I'd like to say a couple more things about the original Pali word, the word samma, which we translated as right. It can also mean complete, or it can mean upright or not crooked. And ditti, which we translate usually as view, can also mean vision. And I like that translation a lot, since often our spiritual practice begins with a moment when we have a penetrating vision into the heart of reality, into the nature of reality. We see something from within, even if just for a moment. And a vision is quite different from a view. A view can be quite theoretical. And we are quite good at views, yes? Our views, most often completely mistaken, govern our attitudes, our actions, our whole orientation to existence. They provide quite a solid framework for our perceptions through which we tend to interpret our experience, and we call that interpretation reality. All views, let me say it again, all views are incomplete. These views lie behind our choices and our goals and our efforts to turn these goals from ideas into reality. So there are two basic kinds of views. It's not too difficult to imagine what these might be. Right views and wrong views. These two different kinds of views the Buddha teaches lead to very different courses of action and quite often to very different results. If we hold a wrong view, even if that view is vague, it will lead us towards courses of action that will end up in suffering. On the other hand, if we cultivate right or complete or clear view or vision, then that view will steer us towards right action quite naturally, as we heard earlier in that little excerpt from the discourse in the middle, Majjhima Nikaya, the middle length sayings. Very naturally, right view will bring about the other path factors, and therefore towards freedom from suffering through our views of ourselves or towards the world. They might seem less important than action. But when we look deeply, we see that our views are the most important in determining the whole course of our future development. The Buddha actually said in the Anguttara Nikaya that he saw no single factor so responsible for the rising of unhelpful states of mind as wrong view, and no factor as helpful for the arising of wholesome states of mind, of beneficial states of mind, as right view. So he also says that there's no single factor responsible for our suffering as important as wrong view, and no factor as powerful in promoting the good of ourselves and others as cultivating right view. The fullest flowering of right view involves a deep, personal, embodied understanding of the teaching of the Buddha right in our own life, from our own experience. And in some way, it can be said that its range is equal to the range of the Dharma itself. But for our purposes, two kinds of right view seem to be important for us to contemplate together today and this week. One is everyday or ordinary right view. This is kind of the first aspect of right view, ordinary or everyday right view. Everyday right view involves, involves a correct kind of vision of the way things operate in this world. The other kind of view is what we call superior right view, which leads to liberation from the round of samsara, this endless round of suffering. So everyday right view, understanding causes and conditions, the way things are manifested, and why they are the way they are. And then a superior kind of right view, which leads to liberation from that round of suffering. By the way, don't look down on every day. It's not a value judgment. In the Zen world, in fact, every day is one of the highest attainments of all. The highest attainment is to be absolutely ordinary. The three stages of insight in the Zen world are described as seeing mountains as mountains and rivers as rivers. And then to see that mountains are not mountains and rivers are not rivers. And then coming to the point where we see that mountains are mountains and rivers are rivers. I had a kind of an existential crisis, speaking of everyday. For many years, when I received my Dharma name, I received it in the Chinese tradition. And when I received my 5 mindfulness training name, which is our lineage name, they thought that because I was Australian, they would write my name in Roman characters. So they wrote Ping Fan in Chinese, and no accents or any in Pinyin, without any accents or anything. So just Pingfan, Ping Fan. And I asked one of the lay people, I really should have asked one of the monastics, but I was shy back then. And I asked one of the lay people to write the Chinese characters for my name. And they wrote the 2 characters there that it basically said peaceful direction. And I didn't think anything of it, peaceful direction. So when I came to Plum Village and I was accepted as a student of Tay, Tay asked for my lineage name, my 5 mindfulness training name, and I gave it to him and he started to smile. And I was wondering why that was, and he said, "Are you sure this is your name?" And I said, "Well, yeah, that's what I was given, Ping Fan." And he said, "But they wrote these characters, peaceful direction, but actually, when you write those 2 characters together, peaceful direction, Ping Fan in Chinese or Bin Phuong in Vietnamese for the Vietnamese speakers, it means square root." And I said, "I think that's what it is, Tay. It's peaceful direction." So on my ordination certificates, everybody from Plum Village always receives something or other of the heart. So I was, when I was, Tay took me as his disciple, he added the character heart or Xin, Tam in Vietnamese. So in Vietnamese, my Dharma name, my lineage name is Tam Bin Phuong, peaceful direction of the heart, but it actually means square root of the heart. So every time there would be an ordination ceremony or something formal and my lineage name would be read, there was always a number of kind of chuckles and people quite amused in the ordination ceremony, those who spoke classical Chinese and things. So for 20 something years, I had this issue with my Dharma name. It's on all of my certificates and things. And so it'll be there for posterity. But finally, I was sitting down with a Chinese scholar and I was talking to him. I said, I think this has to be wrong. It can't be like this. He said, yeah, there's no way you can be called square root of the heart. It just can't have these two meanings. So we were looking and we realized that the character that the layperson wrote years ago, when they looked at the Roman characters, just F-A-N, they wrote the character that sounds like F-A-N-G, Fang, which means direction in Chinese, but it should have really been Fan, which means every day. So in fact, my Dharma name, my lineage name should have actually been everyday peace. But in the Zen world, this sense of everyday peace means in each and every moment, wherever we are, to be able to have that sense of being completely at peace, to not be running anywhere anymore. And it's one of the highest attainments. So I'm very happy that after a quarter of a century, I've transformed from being a square root of the heart to having everyday peace or ordinary peace of the heart. Ordinary is another way to translate the Chinese character Fan. So this is an attainment. It's an attainment to become absolutely ordinary. And so when we talk about everyday or ordinary right view, please don't think that it's somehow less than superior right view. It's not a value judgment. In terms of right or complete view, everyday right view is concerned with the aspects of material and spiritual progress within this round of samsara, within this realm, with the principles that lead to higher and lower states of existence, a little more happiness, a little more peace, a little more transformation, and to relief from suffering. This is already a great thing. And the second kind of view, superior right view, is concerned with the principles of how to liberate ourselves from this round of samsara, this round of suffering. And it doesn't only aim at progress spiritually from life to life, or even in this life, but at complete liberation from the cycles of suffering in each and every moment. Why don't we have a sound of the bell? So let's have a little look at everyday right view, the first kind of right view, just a little pointing out instruction. So everyday right view involves a grasp, even at some fundamental level, of the law of karma. I am so excited to talk about karma. Everyday right view's literal name in Pali is the right view of the ownership of action. Kamma Sakata Samaditi. And it reminds us of one of the 5 remembrances, which is each of us is the owner of our actions, the inheritor of our actions, and our actions are our true belongings. There are only true belongings. So to understand the basics of this everyday form of right view, we have to examine the meaning of its key term, karma. So contrary to what many of us think, the word karma or karma actually means any volitional action, an intentional act. And the vast majority of our actions are intentional. In the West, we often use karma to refer to the fruits of actions. But in Buddhism, karma refers to the volitional action itself, any intentional action itself, not the fruit. If we see karma as fruits of action, like people tend to do in the West, saying things like, it's my karma, or it's their karma, and so on, then we can easily begin to feel powerless or like a victim. But Buddhism teaches that all of us have the capacity to choose differently, to transform our situation. In fact, the Buddha identified action or karma with volition. In the Anguttara Nikaya, the Buddha actually says, friends, it's volition. As we learned about volition in the Four Nutriments. It is volition that I call action, karma. Having willed or being pulled by some desire, whether it's a wholesome desire or unwholesome or a mixture or aversion, one performs an action through body, speech, or mind. So understanding that action or karma in Pali and Sanskrit and volition are one or operate in unison makes karma an originating factor, a factor that originates in the mind, that makes action something that originates in the mind. Volition comes into being through any one of the three doors: body, speech, and mind. So a volition that expresses itself through our body is called a bodily action, a bodily karma. A volition that's expressed through speech is a verbal action or a verbal karma. And a volition that issues in thoughts, plans, ideas, regrets, and so on, or other mental states without manifesting outwardly is a mental action. So often, two or three doors operate simultaneously, like a body and speech or speech and mind, these kind of things, they can operate together. So by looking in this way, we can see that the factor of volition or intentionality expresses itself through three channels. So right view is more than a theoretical understanding of the concept of karma or volitional action. It's seeing clearly the distinction between what's wholesome or helpful for our whole person development and that of others, and what is not, as well as recognizing the roots of each type within ourselves and within others. I know what some of you might be thinking: what's wholesome and what's unwholesome? What's beneficial and what's unbeneficial? Wholesome, or kusala in Pali, means skillful. And it's any action of body, speech, and mind that's in line with our deepest aspiration of liberation from suffering and of opening our heart. And it benefits ourselves and others. Unwholesome would be anything that produces the opposite. So that's something for each of us to discover for ourselves. Actions are ultimately categorized as wholesome or unwholesome on the basis of the underlying motives called roots or mula. So we've spoken about the three main roots in our consciousness previously: greed, aversion, and delusion. Any action arising from these three roots would tend to be, most likely 99.99%, be unwholesome. The three wholesome roots are their opposites: generosity, loving kindness, unconditional friendliness to all that is, and wisdom. Any action, any volitional action arising from these three roots is most likely, again, 99.99%, a wholesome action of body, speech, and mind. So as practitioners, we need to discover these things within ourselves, to look into our intentional actions of body, speech, and mind, and examine, to become curious about the motivations, the volitions that bring them about, that we carry with them. So in some way, as you're listening to this talk, if you followed the earlier series and you listen to the talk on volition, you'll see that there's a deepening understanding of volition in this talk than we touched on in the previous series, which was a little more introductory. We're seeing now that volition is itself karma. It's identified. It's absolutely the same as action. So discover it within yourself. Have a look at where the roots of your actions come from. It's quite an interesting and revelatory process. You know, friends, Buddhism is very big on this. If you've been a practitioner for a while, you'll know this. I thought that it might be helpful to share one such list, since we're talking about skillful and not yet skillful action, wholesome and unwholesome action. So I'd like to share one of those lists, which is the so-called 10 courses of wholesome and 10 courses of unwholesome action. Among the 10 listed under each category, there are 3 that are wholesome or unwholesome by way of the bodily door. There are 4 that are verbal, and there are 3 that are mental. Bear that in mind, like always our mouth can get away from us, huh? So there's 4 in the verbal category. The 10 courses of wholesome and unwholesome karma or action can be listed like this. I'll divide them by the way that they express themselves. So by bodily action, wholesome and unwholesome, the first is protecting or destroying life, wholesome and unwholesome. The second is generosity, or taking what is not given. The third is guarding our sense doors. And then the reverse of that is wrong conduct in regard to sense pleasures. In terms of verbal action, the 4 kinds of verbal wholesome and unwholesome action, the first is truthfulness or false speech. The next one is building people up with words. This is a wholesome thing, like watering their flower, helping them to see the beauty of themselves and so on. And then the reverse of that, the unwholesome side, would be slanderous speech, or speech that tears another person down. The next is gentle and kind speech, or harsh speech, which would be the unwholesome aspect. And then the 4th kind of beneficial or unbeneficial verbal karma or verbal action is talk on the Dharma, or idle chit-chat. And then by way of the mental door, by mental action, the first of the 3 factors of wholesome mental action is satisfaction with conditions, satisfaction with what we have. And then the unwholesome is covetousness or envy, feeling like we lack something and always having this seeking mind. The next is loving kindness, this sense of unconditional friendliness towards ourselves and others. And then, of course, the unwholesome side will be ill will towards ourselves and others. And then the third kind of third course of wholesome action through way of the mind is right view. And then the unwholesome side of that would be wrong view, of course. So whatever we do through these 3 doors of body, speech, and mind, it leaves an imprint on our consciousness, and that imprint eventually ripens in some way. So understanding this on a visceral level, on an experiential level, is to have right view of the everyday or the ordinary kind. Let's have a sound of the bell. So we'll have a little look into superior right view so we can contemplate this week. So the right view, the everyday, ordinary right view of action and its fruits, of karma, volitional action and its fruits, is essential, but by itself, it doesn't necessarily lead us to liberation. Maybe just to leading a good life, which is something wonderful in itself. I once had a student who said to me, you know what, Temple Bhai, I don't really think there's anything wrong with samsara. It's okay here. You know, I'm happy, which I said, okay. But the inspiration to liberate ourselves and others from the entire round of samsara depends on the understanding of the Four Noble Truths right in our lives. This is the superior or the higher form of right view, understanding and seeing and understanding the operation of the Four Noble Truths right in the heart of your life. In fact, it's called the noble right view. The Buddha himself actually defines the path factor of right view expressly in terms of these four truths. So what now is right view? It's understanding of suffering, dukkha, understanding of the origin of this suffering, understanding the ending of this suffering, that this suffering can come to an end, can transform, and understanding of the way leading to the sensation of suffering. So your Eightfold Path, the Eightfold Path for you in your own life, might start with a conceptual or intellectual understanding of the Four Noble Truths. And if we're fortunate, it reaches its culmination in a direct vision of these same truths and their reality right in the heart of our lives. This penetrating insight, again, doesn't come from books or from hearing Dharma talks. It would be great if it did. But rather from allowing the Dharma to burst forth in your own life. Through you putting forth the effort to apply these teachings in each and every moment and not behaving like a victim of samsara anymore. In Australia, we often say, stop mucking around. And this is quite appropriate because if samsara, this endless cycle of suffering, this endless external and internal round of suffering, is called the world of dust, then many of us are at least knee deep in the mud. It's time to stop mucking around. As the Buddha said, he also said this. He said, work out your own liberation with diligence. And that was the Buddha's way of saying to you, stop mucking around and behaving like a victim. You can wake up to your situation and you can transform your suffering. You have the capacity. However your suffering manifests, defensiveness, anger, and so on, there's no reason why not. There's no reason why we can't transform our suffering. With superior right view, we're seeing the noble truths in your life. You're seeing things as they are and how they've come to be and how you, how you have co-created this whole round. So it can be said that the right view of the Four Noble Truths forms both the beginning, the very starting point, and the culmination of the way to the end of the transformation of suffering. Later, at the end of our series on the Noble Eightfold Path, we're going to delve deeply. We're going to dive deeply into each of the Four Noble Truths. But for now, we'll just touch them deeply to end this talk. The first Noble Truth is the truth of suffering, the truth of dukkha, the unsatisfactoriness of existence. And it reveals itself in impermanence, in pain, and this sense of incompleteness that we often have. And the second Noble Truth points out that suffering, all suffering has a cause, and that cause can be discovered. And the third Noble Truth is the insight that liberation is possible. Not only possible, but if we apply the Noble Eightfold Path, it's probable. The fourth noble truth shows us the way to liberation, shows us how to transform our situation, and that is the Noble Eightfold Path. So it's an essential exercise for us to use the Four Noble Truths as a framework to contemplate each thing that arises, to recognize it, to look into its causes. How has it come to be? And to understand that it's possible to choose differently. And if we chose differently, what would that look like? How would that feel? And then to reflect on each of the path factors in turn, right understanding, right intention, right speech, right action, right livelihood, and so on, in relationship to the current situation that you find yourself in. This is the practical application of the Noble Eightfold Path. So dear beloved community, I hope that you found something useful from tonight's talk. It was a little longer than the other talks will be on the Noble Eightfold Path, since we wanted to offer a little overview of the whole Noble Eightfold Path and its background, and then go into right view. From next week, there'll probably be about 45 minutes or so on. So I hope you found something helpful. It's certainly been a delight to be together with everybody. And from the bottom of my heart, I wish each of you well this coming week. And I hope you have a delightful week cultivating right view. We'll end this evening with a sound of the bell.